Steve Dempsey with the Bay Area News Group, and welcome to our discussion on how legalized recreation use of marijuana is working or not working in the state of Colorado. And perhaps here in California, we might get some hints on what to expect if Proposition 64 passes here on November the 8th. So here to give us a look from Colorado is Denver Post Cannabis Editor-in-Chief Ricardo Baca. Ricardo, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Steve. Thanks for having me, man.
Cool. So after voters gave their approval to the private consumption of marijuana, it became legal in December 2012 in Colorado, and then the first stores officially opened on January 1st, 2014. Ricardo, tell us about how the law, what the law is in Colorado.
So when we passed our version of what you have out there, ours was called Amendment 64. Obviously, California's is called Proposition 64. What that ultimately legalized was the possession, use, growing of retail cannabis. And so, like California, we had a long-standing medical marijuana economy. And unlike California, ours was regulated. And so it was simpler for Colorado regulators to write regulations for a recreational cannabis system because they already had regulation for a medical system. So that's one unique challenge that could be posed in California.
So basically, what does the law say in Colorado?
It just primarily allows for the recreational use and sale and growth of cannabis. So one of the things that our law includes that's unusual compared to maybe something like what you see up in Washington State is that individuals, I myself, we can grow up to 6 plants. I live with my wife, so we could grow up to 12 plants if we want. That part of the law isn't available in Washington State. So that's something that's somewhat unusual, and I know that that is something that's written into Proposition 64 in California as well.
Okay. Well, I think one of the big positives, I guess, for people who were, recreational marijuana users, to a certain point, they don't have to worry about there's no fear of being arrested for any like small amounts, and I guess it's easier now to obtain.
It's a lot easier to obtain. Yeah, anybody with an ID proving that they're 21 years of age or older, that can be a passport or an ID from another state or country, can legally purchase cannabis. And you're right. It's no longer a priority for law enforcement, and they simply can't arrest you if you yourself are in possession of less than an ounce of cannabis or its equivalent in terms of edibles or concentrates. So it's definitely changed the game, and that's not to say that it's halted all marijuana-related arrests here in Colorado, because those are still happening for people who are growing too many plants, for people who have more than an ounce, and for people who are using in places that they shouldn't be using, because public consumption is something that, one, we still haven't figured out how it works here in Colorado. It's still it's still in its infancy, but two, it's something that residents of Denver County will be voting on next month.
So talk about that a little bit. What are they going to be voting for in Denver County?
So public consumption, when we talk about that, we think of people lighting a joint in a park or hitting a vaporizer outside a bar. And really that's happening in places around the globe. Of course, it's been around for decades in Amsterdam. Toronto has a very pretty elaborate system of cannabis lounges that are cannabis only, no alcohol, no anything else. But what we're looking at is a social use permit that different businesses could apply for, whether you're a restaurant, bar, art gallery, movie theater, that would allow some kind of consumption on premise. In Colorado, we have what's known as the Clean Indoor Air Act. And so you can't smoke inside almost anywhere. That's not legal. And that's not what this would be legalizing. But it would be legalizing the use of a vaporizer inside an art gallery, or edibles inside a restaurant, or even potentially if a bar had like maybe a patio behind the bar, or maybe a rooftop that was at least 25 feet away from a public space like a sidewalk, then if you have that outdoor space, you could then offer the consumption of smoking. You could light a joint, and this is dependent on the vote. And then if the city and county of Denver voters say yes to this, then what it would involve is that business would have to get the permission from a neighborhood group to offer that kind of a permit. And so it really brings everybody together into the process, not only the business owner, but also the neighborhood groups and the regulators.
So lead me to understand here. Although in the state of Colorado, it's legal, the recreational use of marijuana is legal, we're seeing different ordinances or different laws from county to county, city to city.
Exactly. And really, when people who are talking about legalizing and regulating cannabis in this modern era, a very familiar term you'll hear is the Colorado model, because since we were the first to implement these sales, we voted on the same day as Washington State to legalize this, but we implemented our system 5 or 6 months before Washington State. So that's a very big part of the Colorado model, is that local control. The activists who wrote our Amendment 64 knew that not all of Colorado wanted to offer these legal recreational sales, and so they gave local municipalities the opportunity to opt out. And many of them have. In fact, a majority of counties in Colorado do not allow the recreational sale of marijuana, but a majority of the most populous counties, the ones with the biggest, largest populations, they do allow the recreational sales. But, all of those counties and cities, they have the right to impose different taxes, to be medical only if they want to, or even we don't want the shops and we don't want these products, these infused products made in our county, but maybe they allow the cannabis testing facilities, the laboratories, to come into those counties and operate there. And what we're seeing is that everybody who's followed Colorado since then really has kind of pushed that local control, because it does give the municipalities a say in this still controversial conversation.
But it's not really chaotic, is it? Going from, oh, I'm in this city, I'm okay, but I'm in that city, I'm not.
So what they can't do is make illegal the possession, the very things outlined in Amendment 64. These counties can't say that you can't possess that. But they can say they don't want it sold there. So yeah, if you're driving to a pot shop and you have to drive through a couple more counties on your way home, there's no concern about that. The one thing to be aware of is the law here says that you are supposed to keep your products inside, inside like your trunk or the equivalent. And so that's kind of the equivalent to an alcohol-centered open container law.
Oh, that's interesting. Now, I guess one of the big selling points for this was the creation of more revenue for the state through sales taxes, and I'm sure local governments as well are gaining more money through taxes as well. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, and this is a very big part of the conversation, because the 9 states, including California, that are voting on recreational or medical marijuana acts in next month, that's a very big part of it. What are the taxes going to look like? And what we're here to say from the future, basically, from the front lines of legalization, is that those taxes are real and they are happening, but they're not enough to save a struggling state economy or a struggling school system. Last year, we saw the sale of about $1 billion of cannabis in Colorado. That involved about it's not. Colorado is a medium-sized state, and here we have an annual operating budget of about $27 billion. And so when you compare that $27 billion to $135 million, you're making a dent in some very important areas. But I think a lot of voters, when they first were voting on Amendment 64 here in Colorado, and they were told that the first 40 million of a very specific excise tax on the recreational cannabis would go toward a capital school construction fund. That sounded like a lot of money to them. And now there's some disappointed voters that our schools are still in need of funding. Last year, that excise tax specifically raised 35 million for that capital school construction fund. This year, it will definitely be 40 million, but still you can only do so much with that. And so that's what we're starting to see. But another side of the conversation too, because it's not only about cannabis sales, there's everything else happening around it. You know, there's the employment figures, there's how much money are these indoor cultivations spending on electricity, on labor costs, and also straight up packaging. You know, there's so many ancillary companies to the industry that are not making marijuana. They're not plant touching, as we say, but they're still integral to the industry, serving the industry, whether they're a security company, a packaging company, a law firm, an HR company, accounting services. And when you take all that together, we've been wondering what that really looks like. And actually a very important report came out this morning. We have it on our site right now, which is thecannabis.co. And it shows that marijuana in Colorado is more than a more than $2.3 billion industry at this time. And that includes all of the ancillary products to this industry. And so that just shows that, yeah, we might have only sold $1 billion of weed last year, but it was actually a $2.3 billion industry. And then there are different taxes and employment figures that come along with that. And so it is substantial, especially because you're taking so much of this out of a market that is unregulated. I mean, a black and gray market, which you guys know very well, just straight north of there, up in the Emerald Triangle, those grows are not being taxed properly. If we're talking about a regulated market, they're not being monitored. And so there are those advantages to a regulated market.
But has this created a different kind of job market? I mean, I would think that with an industry of that caliber, that's going to create some jobs. That's going to start maybe some businesses that wouldn't be there before.
Sure. And I'm just looking up our piece on the story right now, and it looks like the cannabis industry, which is the fastest growing business sector in Colorado, it's also credited with creating more than 18,000 jobs, and that's full-time jobs. So yeah, it's a legitimate figure. At the same time, as journalists, it's our job to put these numbers into context. And so I think what's most important to pay attention to is that while these numbers aren't going to save our struggling schools or budget deficits in the state's system, they are bringing tax monies into a regulated market that never existed before. And that's very important. So, I think that's just one important thing for voters in not only California, but also Nevada, Arizona, Massachusetts, and Maine to consider, since those 5 states are voting on recreational and another 4 are voting on medical.
Okay, so let's switch gears just a little bit here. So what happened to the pot dealers? What happened to the guys who were selling out there in the street, out of their cars, at their homes? Do they still exist, or did these laws pretty much put them out of business?
Well, I think as much as regulators hoped that this would make the black market extinct, especially when the black market has been thriving for decades. And so what we've seen concretely is that these pot dealers, the illegal pot dealers from back in the day, they have taken a major hit. And I've talked to a few who have straight up said, the margin is no longer there. We can't do this because a Coloradan can get a medical card and get very cheap regulated clean marijuana, or they can just buy recreational and pay higher prices and higher tax rates. But regardless, that affects our bottom line and what we can sell an ounce or an eighth or a pound for. And so they have definitely taken a hit. And we've talked to a number who have gone out of business entirely. I know one guy personally who went back to school. As soon as recreational launched, it wasn't worth it for him anymore because his price per pound dropped in half and he could no longer support his family. He has multiple children. He went back to school, he went into the finance sector, and now he's working for a leading firm that's global. But what, the black market is never going to go away at the same time, if not for a very long time. And so it's still there. And what we're seeing now is people trying to exist in the shadows of the legal market. A lot of people aren't familiar with the peculiarities or the specificities of this law. And so they think that they can rent a house 2 hours south of Denver in Pueblo, Colorado, grow 100 plants and ship it across state borders, which breaks a number of state and federal laws. And we're seeing a lot of those people getting busted. But for every person who's getting busted, surely there are multiple others out there getting away with it.
Okay, that's interesting. So how is the crime rate going in Colorado? I mean, are you seeing, like, let's say, are you seeing a rise in maybe burglaries? Plants are being stolen from residents, and maybe somebody's growing in their backyard and they're hopping the fence and stealing it. And what about like remote areas where there's large number, a larger operation going on of plants growing? Are you seeing kind of a rise in that?
What we're seeing a rise in is primarily pot shop related crimes. People trying to steal, break in and steal money, since this is primarily a cash only industry, or plants. Colorado state law says we must grow indoors as people, as citizens, but also the industry. There's only 1 or 2 counties in the entire state that actually allow outdoor commercial cultivation. So a majority of the commercial and all of the residential is indoor grow only. So if you are growing a plant in your backyard, that's illegal. In general crime, I think, we've talked to a lot of the Denver police and police officers all over the state. Crime in Colorado right now is relatively flat. Some of it's a little bit down, some of it's a little bit up. When we ask these questions about crime in relation to legalization, the police officers and PIOs tell us the two aren't related. Colorado is thriving right now. Our economy is thriving. We have a lot of people moving here. And as a result, crime is simply down across the board. So it has nothing to do with the fact that we've offered these legal sales for the past 3 years.
Well, I guess, and what I read on your website, I guess one of the biggest things for police right now are people growing too much. I guess the police have seized so much marijuana since the new law came in. They're looking to expand facilities. That's how bad it's getting. Can you talk about that?
Sure. I think that comes down to the gray market activity. These people growing marijuana in, for example, just about a mile away from here, this is my home office where I'm working from today. There is a concentrated area of marijuana businesses. They gather there because it's a lot of industrial space and they need to be indoors. It's warehouse space that's adjacent to a major interstate, and therefore it was more affordable 4 or 5, 6 years ago when they went there. And there are very strict zoning requirements as to where these businesses can actually function. And so they all are kind of coagulated over there, and there's a big coagulation of them over here as well in Montbello, a couple miles away. And what happens is an illegal, somebody who is operating on the fringe, somebody who doesn't have a license, somebody who is breaking the law, will rent a house or a warehouse right in the middle of all these businesses and operate as if they are operating legally. And in the early days of recreational, police would do routine checkups, and sometimes they'd get reports, and sometimes they'd visit these other places. And because of our complicated medical system, which includes a very robust caregiver system, sometimes the police couldn't tell if it was a legal grow or an illegal grow. And so that's where a lot of these busts are coming from, where the Denver Police Department is, confiscating a lot of this pot, which is requiring them to hire more personnel and expand their facility for storing and ultimately destroying a lot of this illicitly grown pot.
Well, speaking of confusion, let's talk a little bit about DUIs. I guess I'm not sure if they're on the rise or not, but I would think that there would be some problems to go with something like that, because how do they measure? Okay, you're too stoned to drive, or you're not. Plus, I'm sure you know, THC stays in the blood system a lot longer. So you smoke a joint a week ago, let's say, or something like that, and you're driving along and you blow a stop sign or something. You get pulled over. They test you. I guess there's testing involved. You've got it in your system. How does that work?
So this is one of the biggest and most problematic areas of legalization right now, and that is the science hasn't caught up with how fast we're moving in this social movement. First, briefly on where we're at with DUIs. The Colorado State Patrol was not tracking individual causes of DUIDs before the year 2014. So when you're looking at 2013 data, you know that there was X number of DUIDs, you just didn't know how they were broken down between weed, opiates, and other drugs. 2014 came along, they saw that legalization was happening, they changed that, and now we have data saying, okay, X amount for marijuana, X amount for opiates, and so on. And so we only have 2 full years of data. In the next couple months, we'll have 3, but in that data from the Colorado State Patrol, we actually saw the number of cannabis-related DUIs decline from 2014 to 2015. It only declined by a couple. We're talking single digit, but still, if you compare how much cannabis was available and being sold from 14 to 15, it's an exponential increase. And so I think it shows that education is working. Education on a national level. NTSB gave a grant to Colorado to teach residents that this is an intoxicant and you're not supposed to get behind the wheel when you've used it. And so that's at least encouraging, and we'll see what those numbers say in January, February when the State Patrol has them. But getting back to the how, I think that's a really frustrating part of this, that I know state legislatures across the country are increasingly frustrated, because right now this is how we measure cannabis intoxication. It's done through a blood test. They determine how many nanograms of activated THC is in your blood by the milliliter. So the law in Colorado is if you have more than 5 nanograms of active THC in your milliliter of blood, then you are considered too stoned to be behind the wheel. But as you mentioned, cannabis is this fat-soluble substance, THC, these cannabinoids. They're fat-soluble. They store themselves in our blood, in our system, in a way that alcohol doesn't. So while a blood test is a very accurate measurement of intoxication for alcohol, it is a very inaccurate measurement for intoxication with marijuana. And that's why a number of researchers and education facilities and businesses are out there trying to figure out different blood tests. How can we better determine cannabis intoxication? Because this is an issue. You know, you shouldn't be behind the wheel after getting high. And some of those things that they're experimenting with right now is there a breathalyzer for cannabis that can moderate recent use and actual intoxication? Another study I know of that we've written about is gauging saliva. Can we take a saliva test? You know, you're in your car, the police officer's behind you. Will that saliva test give you an accurate gauge? And right now we just don't know. And that's frustrating, and rightly so, to a lot of these state legislatures that are having the people voting on legalization, and they're not ready for this quite yet. And I'll throw out one more quick thing. A lot of this comes down to the fact that there's more about marijuana that we don't know than what we do know, and that comes back to it's been cripplingly hard to research this. Even though the Obama administration 3 times in the last 4 years has made Efforts to lighten that process of actually applying to research this plant. Researching marijuana right now is still more difficult than researching heroin, and something needs to change there, because it's halting up important studies on the efficacy of determining, does marijuana help PTSD patients as they say it does? And why is it helping these kids with epilepsy and not helping others with epilepsy? We just don't have answers to these questions, and we're desperate for the research to go through so we have a better idea.
Well, perhaps, you know, as more states vote to legalize it, that might accelerate the research, you know.
I think so. I think it's inevitable, and I think it's going to accelerate the federal government's movement in general. I mean, if California voters say yes to Proposition 64 next month, as every poll says they will right now, from the LA Times to our colleagues at the Orange County Register, you know, it's very, that's going to force the federal government's hand, at least to an extent where they need to start considering the dangers around banking, the need for research, some of these very big issues that we just don't have locked in just yet.
Okay. One big concern in California is the effect this would have with kids. They're going to be seeing the ads, seeing their parents getting stoned. Plants, you know, are being grown like maybe right across the street from schools. We don't know, and maybe they have easier access. I mean, are kids getting influenced by this?
Well, I think inevitably any substance that becomes recreationally available will influence a population of kids and teenagers. And I'm not positive about the wordage of 64 in California, but one thing I do want to throw out, I would guess that the government wouldn't allow zoning like cultivations to be across the street from schools. That's a very standardized part of the regulatory process where they need to be a half mile away, a mile away. I'm not positive just because I haven't read Prop 64, but I know that schools, daycare centers, churches are very, very central to, hey, let's keep any and all cannabis businesses away from that in most regulated environments. But there is some good news on this front. Of course, people see stories about more kids going into hospitals in Colorado for accidental ingestion, and that's true. More kids have gone into hospitals for the accidental ingestion of marijuana since it was legalized, and that's gone up. But it's only gone up in single digits, you know, maybe 9 more kids than the previous year, maybe 16 more kids than the previous year. Obviously, that is too many. That's not okay. But if you're realistic and you put that in the context of other things that are around our homes on a daily basis, things like the little pods that you put in your dishwasher, which are usually brightly colored and are now individually packaged because of this very problem, those are something that children want to put in their mouths and ultimately ingest and are ultimately a lot more toxic. So the data that we're starting to get now is encouraging on this front. And granted, while we need more, this is what we know about teen use. 2 different surveys have been released by the state of Colorado and also by the federal government. That's SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health arm of the White House. Both of these studies show that teen use in Colorado is exactly flat in 2014 and 2015. Statewide, teen use is the same as it was before these recreational sales started. There's also a statistic out there that does show that in Colorado, we are #1 for teen use. And that is a new one. What ultimately happened is we used to be #3, and the people who used to be 1 and 2, they actually saw theirs drop, and so now we're #1, even though we stayed flat. And so that's just 2 years of data. Obviously, we need a lot more, and as journalists, we're very hungry for that data, and we'll see what happens with the 16 data when they have that. And I think, you know, I just talked with the state's top doctor, the head of our health department in Colorado, and he just said, yeah, we're going to need 10 years of this data to really know legalization's impact on our teenagers in the state. So that's what we're kind of waiting for.
Okay, so I know it's probably kind of limited, but for what you know about Prop 64 here in California, what similarities, do you see any similarities between what's being proposed here and what's actually happening in Colorado?
Yeah, there are a lot of similarities between the two amendments. As I mentioned earlier, there's the Colorado model, which so many people have just studied to see what has worked and what hasn't worked. And as well, there's dissimilarities. I know a big issue among Californians, especially those who oppose Proposition 64, is this element of advertising. And I think that's something that needs to be watched very carefully. In Colorado, we have extremely strict regulations on where these cannabis businesses can advertise. For example, I run a website called The Cannabis, and we can actually prove through our metrics that we have a readership that is more than 70, 80% 21 and older. Less than 20% of our readership is below that legal age. And because we can prove that, then we can accept cannabis advertising. But there hasn't been any cannabis advertising on the mainstream television networks here in Colorado. That is not legal. They have very strict guidelines to abide by when activating a booth or a tent at a local event, at a music festival or a 5K run or anything. So we have very strict regulations here. From what I can tell, the Proposition 64 regulations on advertising are looser in California, and I know that that's a concern among opponents, and I think that's a realistic concern.
Okay, well, Ricardo, I appreciate you joining us today. It was very educational, and we'll see what happens in California on November 8th with Proposition 64. But thank you very much for educating us.
Oh, I appreciate the time, and I would encourage anybody who's interested in digging deeper into these subjects that we've been discussing, check out all of our websites, from the San Jose Mercury News to the Denver Post, and the Cannabis.co is ultimately all of our clearinghouse for marijuana reporting and journalism. We have 27 newspapers in California, as you know, Steve, and we're bringing together the best of that reporting into the Cannabis, as well as everything that we're producing here in Colorado and on the East Coast with freelancers. So thank you for having me, and yeah, I'm looking forward to November 8th to see how all this shakes down.
Yeah, we are too. So, Ricardo Baca, Denver Post Cannabis Editor-in-Chief. Thank you for joining us.
Take care.